coming across this way, right, from medial to lateral, 6, 7, 8. And then behind the olive, 9, 10, and then 11's below that. So in a row, 9, 10, 11. And then come back up in front of the olive for 12. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all kind of surround the olive.
Mm-hmm.
And 5 is really easy. It's really big, right in the middle side of the pons.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what's the bulge right here? Right here.
Ganglia.
Which one?
Dorsal root.
The dorsal root.
There's no ventral root ganglia, right?
No.
It's just dorsal root.
The ventral root contains axons of multipolar neurons. So those cell bodies are in the CNS. Just axons going through the ventral root. But it's unipolar neurons that form the DRG and the dorsal root. So the cell bodies of those unipolar neurons are just outside of the cord in the DRG. Here's those bulges again. And when you locate that, that's the easiest way to figure out front and back.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing you could look for is you do have grooves on both sides, but remember one is really big, really wide,
Yeah.
and the other one's very thin.
Fissure.
Yeah, so you find that really big, wide one that we do call the fissure, and that's front, anterior median fissure. And then this little sliver, that's posterior median sulcus. And then what about the white right here?
Commissure.
White, posterior commissure, and this one?
I can feel.
White, anterior commissure, and the gray? Gray posterior commissure, or posterior gray commissure in here? Anterior gray commissure. So there's 4 commissures right there. And then that little opening,
Central canal.
and this here.
Lateral horn, the gray matter.
And what nucleus is found in the lateral horn?
The neuron cell bodies of the autonomic nervous system.
So it is cell bodies of preganglionic sympathetic fibers. But each nucleus, each collection of cell bodies has a different name. So it's some combination of somatic or visceral, motor or sensory.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those 4 combinations are the 4 nuclei. So you have a somatic sensory, a somatic motor, a visceral sensory, a visceral motor. The visceral motor is the autonomic. So if we're asking for the name of the nucleus found in the lateral horn, visceral motor nucleus. Autonomic nucleus is fine too. All of this back here,
Sensory motor.
dorsal horn. And then we can break that up into a posterior half and an anterior half. What's in the posterior half?
Sensory motor.
Somatic or visceral?
Visceral.
And it can be sensory motor, right? It's sensory or motor.
Visceral is posterior.
Well, so the visceral sensory is right next to the visceral motor. That'll help you. So if this is visceral motor, and we're trying to figure out if it's this
Then
half or
that
this
will be
half,
Visceral
visceral sensory is here. It's the anterior part of the dorsal horn.
Somatic.
So they're right next to each other. And then think of somatic as being at the tips. So the whole ventral horn is somatic motor, and then the posterior tip of the dorsal horn is somatic sensory. So visceral, visceral, somatic, somatic.
Mm-hmm.
How about all this white matter? So all of this, and all of this.
There's the white columns. White
So,
matter columns.
so which one, if we're on this side?
Anterior.
Anterior white columns. All of this white matter.
Lateral.
All of that. And then all of this.
Posterior.
White
Mhm.
columns.
And what's another name for white column?
Funiculus.
Right, so dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, funiculi, plural, anterior funiculi. And then within the dorsal columns, dorsal funiculi, what tracts do you find there? Or fasciculi? What tracts or fasciculi make up the dorsal white columns?
Cuneatus and what's the other one?
It's named after a lower limb muscle. Yeah. So funiculus gracilis, funiculus cuneatus. They make up the dorsal horn. And that's part of the dorsal column, medial lemniscal pathway. So what's this here?
Anterior root.
Or ventral root. What axons run through there? So notice here they've got a mixture of red and black, two different types. So is one sensory, one motor? Is it all motor, two different types of motor? What's going to be found in the ventral root?
All motor.
It's all motor.
All motor,
Dorsal
different
root is all sensory. And the different colors represents visceral versus somatic, sensory. And then here it's visceral or autonomic versus somatic motor. Do you have both types of neurons in all ventral roots? Do you have a mixture of somatic and visceral motor axons running through all of your ventral roots?
Yeah.
No.
No.
So you only have visceral motor axons where you have lateral horns. Right? So you have lateral horns in the thoracolumbar region of the cord. So that's where you have a mixture of visceral and somatic motor. But outside of, for example, above thoracic, cervical region, it's all somatic motor, no visceral. And you only have lateral horns in the thoracolumbar regions of the cord. So the fact that we see one tells us this is probably thoracic. It could be upper lumbar, L1, L2 area. And then where your two roots come together, what do they form right here when they fuse?
Spinal nerve.
Right, and that is actually it. That's the spinal nerve. Because as soon as these other branches come off, new names.
There's a ton of those.
Well, yes, we haven't learned them yet, but you have a dorsal ramus, you have a ventral ramus. The dorsal ramus is small, ventral ramus is really large. It is what continues out. It is what you would think of as the spinal nerve, but it's technically a ventral ramus. And then these two are called rami communicantes. One's gray and one's white. And the reason is, one has type B fibers and one has type C. So the white ramus has type B. It's preganglionic autonomic fibers. And the gray ramus has type C, postganglionic autonomic fibers. So that we will cover this week. So that would be the only other thing to add to this model. Everything else is chapter 12, except this part here. Dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, rami communicantes. That's from chapter 13.